All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion today. I know I framed this as a debate, but that's a little bit clickbait, but I do want to have, I think, a good discussion today and good debate on this whole question of usury. Because this has, I think, been a discussion in online circles for quite a while, but often not in sort of a deeply intellectual way. And so I tried to find very good representatives of the traditional Catholic position on the charging of usury and a good representative of the Jewish tradition on the issue of charging usury. And so today I've brought on Michael Humphreys, who's actually published on this question of usury. You can find him online, I think on YouTube and on Substack and on X as Lend Hoping Nothing. And then as well, I've brought on Tractatus to defend the Jewish position. Tractatus and I debated about a year ago on the Book of Daniel, and that was a very good discussion. So I thought it would be good to bring him back on. And so I don't have too much to add in this discussion. This is not my area of research, so I'll just be moderating today. And so with that, Tractatus, if you want to kick it off with your presentation.
Yeah, sure thing. Okay, so if I just click the presentation, or do you have to enable it?
There we go. Oh, there.
Awesome. Right. Okay, yeah. Thanks very much, Gideon, for having me back. Michael, thank you so much for agreeing to, I think you actually were the one who proposed this to speak about this topic, and something which I'm very interested in for a number of reasons. I just want to kind of get the acknowledgements and disclosures out of the way. Last year when Gideon and I debated Sefer Daniel, or the Book of Daniel, both of us had kind of expressed this sense that, the kind of Christian-Jewish dialogue that's taking place, certainly in the online circles, is kind of at a low ebb. And, we wanted to start having conversations that would foster better intellectual discourse. That doesn't mean that we're going to all end up agreeing with each other. On the contrary, I think, Christianity and Judaism are irreconcilable largely, but that doesn't mean that we can't have an intellectual exchange where we understand each other and that their perspectives a little bit better. And that's, one of the things why I just want to, as a disclaimer, say, I like Catholicism more than other areas of Christianity because there's a concrete body of scholarship that you can really interact with in a rational way and discuss and kind of understand. Not so dissimilar to Judaism in regard to what's Jewish law, halacha, and, kind of in Islam. And they have Quranic law, but in some areas of Christianity, it's harder to have a discussion. And who better than Michael, because he actually provided a very useful catechism on usury that was very helpful for me, at least in terms of just I was looking up a lot of these sources anyway, but it was nice to see them on his website translated, and makes my life a lot easier. And this topic in particular is really of interest to me for another reason, because we have, I think, amongst the lay scholar, the lay folk, there's a notion of what piety looks like. It's either a monk secluded in a monastery praying, or from Judaism some sort of a Torah scholar hunkered away in the base medrash or the learning center in the synagogue, and but real piety is actually understanding, how we interact with each other and adhering to the law and being, righteous people. And what better topic than usury to really kind of flesh out how and why it's, it's so important to understand details and think about these things, which these topics become hard and they're involved, and they deserve, our intellectual thought and apply that to our everyday lives, because this is everywhere. And it's, I think it's really important. And my intent here is to kind of do my best job to present the, the Jewish, the Orthodox Jewish, the Torah Jewish perspective of what exactly is intended by the prohibition of lending with interest according to the Hebrew Bible. And I do have a small background. I did get a master's in finance from a very fancy institution. And I have actually, in manuscript form at least, I have not published it yet, but have worked on a set of what's called Shilas and Shuvas, their legal responsa around decentralized finance and blockchain technology with respect to Jewish law, and a lot of that touches on this topic of loaning with interest. And anyway, okay, so thanks and praise to the Creator, blessed be He. And with that, let's kick it off. So I just wanted to frame the debate the best way I could understand it. I looked at a lot of the classic Christian sources, and the big names that seem to, or be surrounding this very topic. I found like Aristotle, who obviously is not Christian. He predates Christianity, but he seems kind of very important in Christian thought in general. Augustine, Ambrose, and Aquinas. And we're going to really drill down into Aquinas. But I just wanted to kind of flag Aristotle at the beginning because, he's kind of very clear that he does not like usury. He thinks that it's most reasonably hated, and that he doesn't understand it essentially because he thinks that the purpose of money is for exchange, and therefore, all you're doing is just kind of like increasing money upon money, and this is not what he views to be a proper lifestyle. And you see maybe not that exact sentiment, but certainly the antipathy expressed very clearly in the early church fathers and ultimately in Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, which was very fascinating, very interesting for a lot of purposes. And it's that last, I can't really see I can blow this up a little bit, make that better. Anyway, the stream is blocking my ability to read this slide. But anyway, I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit. Oh, there we go. It disappeared. Okay, I wanted to kind of drill down on Aquinas more than anybody else because I feel like he has to address the question, right, that faces, I think, Christianity head on, which is that in the Hebrew Bible, in Deuteronomy specifically, there is it's very clear that like God permitted the lending with interest to non-Israelites, but he forbid it amongst the Israelites. And that was one of the objections that he responds to in this particular passage. And I really wanted to like read it and unpack it. And, maybe Michael can help explain it because I find it very, very difficult to understand. And I, to the point where I don't think it makes sense, but, I'm open to hearing to being corrected and understanding it a little bit better. But I'm just going to read this out loud. I think I copied this directly from your website, so this might be your translation or might be somebody else's. I forget which one. But the Jews were forbidden to take usury from their brethren. This is addressing that exact question from other Jews. By this, we are given to understand that they are taking usury from man is evil simply, right? So he says that it's evil no matter what, because we ought to treat every man as our neighbor and brother. So he understands that the reason why it's evil is because it's a violation of kind of the covenant of man, that we're all brothers and neighbors, which is very interesting. We're going to have to unpack that. And especially in the state of the gospel, where that seems to be universally true. And this is to say, post Jesus, all of man is called to the gospel, so to speak. Hence, it is said without any distinction in Psalm 14:5, although for us it's chapter 15. And then also in Ezekiel, that where he doesn't, where both of those passages speak against, lending with interest, but it doesn't necessarily equivocate in the way that it does in Deuteronomy 20:23. So it's interesting that he points to those, and we'll kind of have to unpack those as well. And then he points to like really Isaiah 56 to help explain why is there this distinction. He ultimately views it as not that it was ever illicit, as I say, it was never a moral good, but it was being done to provide the Israelites some sort of satisfy them so that lest they come, because they just crave to do interest so much, they should ultimately come to do usury against those who worship God. So that's his statement, the best I can understand it, and maybe Michael can articulate where I might be getting things wrong. But just to unpack it, right, like it seems like he's saying that it's universally immoral, regardless of the person, no matter what. But then at the end of the day, he's, I'm just jumping to point 3, he kind of explains why God, he's permitting it so that we not come to a greater evil, which would be to charge interest from people of God. But if you hold that it's universally evil, and it's a violation of brotherhood, why should it matter whether or not the person is a believer in God? I don't totally understand that. And then, going a little bit further, like let's really try and like unpack this. So, according to Aquinas, God is explicitly sanctioning evil acts. He said 23:21 is explicit. You can create a loan with interest to a non-Israelite, and but he's saying that's evil, and he's allowing it because we don't want to come on to a greater evil. So that in and of itself, God being ultimate good, why is it that he's allowing the Israelites to commit a crime? That Aquinas views to be a crime. That's, to me, a very, very big and obvious question right from the start. And again, like we just kind of said, why would the worship of God make it a greater crime if the moral basis was just that we were to treat every man as a neighbor? Not only that, if you think about it from other thing, there are other prohibitions which it is permitted to not do to non-Jews. Despite whatever memes you might have seen on the internet, it is absolutely prohibited to murder non-Jews and to steal from non-Jews. We can have the conversation about what the punishments are relative to what those punishments are for Jews, but it's very clear and unequivocal that you're not allowed to do evil acts. So when it is a legitimately evil act, God does prohibit it. It's not that you're ever allowed to do those things to non-Jews. So it would seem like this is very inconsistent on the part of God to allow for something which is a moral evil in one area, and he would prohibit that for non-Jews as well. But then he permits it in this case. So that inconsistency needs to be understood. Furthermore, his biblical proofs are also very difficult for me to understand because for us, Psalm 15, the fact that he doesn't. His point is that, look, in these verses in Psalms and in Ezekiel, it doesn't re-mention the fact that you aren't allowed to have there is no restatement of the fact that you can lend with interest. So he says, you see, it's true in generality. He doesn't recapitulate Deuteronomy 23:21. But if you think about it, first of all, let's put the Ezekiel one aside, right? In 18:2, 3, and 6, Israel is invoked time and again. So that's the context. So I don't think he needs to, I don't think that you can say Ezekiel 18 is speaking to, Jews and everybody else and the non-Jews as well, because he's clearly only talking to Israel and what Israel is doing. So that's for the context. But moreover, I think this is like a logical flaw, right? Like just because a psalm doesn't recapitulate all of the attendant laws and details of the prohibition does not mean that it's going to, that from how it would then broaden its scope, right? Like in Psalm 92, like it's all about the Sabbath, but he doesn't re-mention the fact that there's a prohibition of lighting fire, and yet, and I don't think that Aquinas would somehow suggest that David is saying that it's now permitted to make fire on the Sabbath. And moreover, like we could be slightly more Talmudic about this question, where it just asks yourself, like, he also doesn't. David also doesn't bring up the fact that the verse that we learn that it's also prohibited to make a loan in a commodity like wine or wheat, right? That's also learned out in that same passage in Deuteronomy. That's also not brought here. So is he going to say because that was not brought here that now how makes those kind of mutams permissible? I don't think so. And so, he says not as though it were licit, but what could be more licit than literally saying the words, the foreigner, like this is what Hashem writes in for himself. He's giving us morality. And so I apologize, by the way, if there's a screaming baby in the background and you guys can hear that. But anyway, now if his textual proof to this notion is totally the Isaiah part is to me, it's like, I don't understand. The dogs that he's talking about here are not at all referring to the Jews and has nothing to do with interest. It's nothing discussing loans. So that also I don't understand. And, I have to also bear in mind here, like, what exactly would the proof be? Like you can't just add a new prohibition to the Torah. You can, the sages do, but they're usually just doing it to protect existing laws. So a lot. I think this Thomas Aquinas passage really needs a lot of understanding, and I don't really totally get it. So anyway, so let's just kind of try to understand the Torah approach and whether we can, and then I'll pass it off to Michael and we can continue. So in Torah Judaism, I just want to be clear, like just because I'm attacking Aquinas, it doesn't mean that we don't take usury not seriously. All financial interest-bearing loans, however minuscule, it doesn't matter like if it's a single penny on top of the principal, that is usury and is forbidden biblically. And not only that, like future contracts, which are not something which most people think about when they think about the prohibition of usury, is also can be very rabbinically forbidden. If you say, well, I'm going to give you some money now to buy wheat from you in the future, we're going to fix the price now. if that person doesn't have the wheat, that is rabbinically prohibited, and it's very important, because you don't want to end up in a situation where the price of the wheat, or that you eventually gets too expensive, and then the person's effectively paying back more than what they were loaned. And the biblical prohibition in Judaism runs both ways. I don't know. Maybe Michael can tell us if this is also true in Catholicism. I wasn't clear when I was reading his catechism on it, but it's forbidden for a lender to lend with interest, but it's also forbidden for the borrower to borrow. That is to say, even if he were to initiate and say, no, it's okay, I want to pay you interest, you're not allowed to do that. You are over on 5 different biblical prohibitions if you do it. If the borrower does it, it's 2. The scribes and witnesses and guarantors to loans would also be over transgressing biblical prohibitions. There's so much on this to prevent it from happening. Even non-monetary forms of interest, where I just it would be valuable to you to know what, not Nancy Pelosi, what stock she's going to be investing in. And I have that information for whatever reason. So you could, get that information from me. That would, and I would give that to you in lieu of interest. That would also be prohibited. And there are, lots of statements from the sages, which make it very, very clear just how much we don't like this. But, the question then has to be raised, though, is there an intrinsic issue with usury? Right? I painted this little hypothetical here. 2 men meet in the field. One has money and wants to buy a desk. The other one wants money for a loan. He needs to buy something for himself. And the one who doesn't have asks the one who does. He says, sorry, no, I want to use the money right now to buy a desk. And he says, well, I understand. And I wouldn't want you to go uncompensated for that interim. Can I pay you for the trouble? He says, okay, that sounds fine to me. They shake on it. Okay. Now, this is a question to Michael. Without deferring to church fiat, can you rationally explain what is evil about this, consensual financial obligation? I know my esteemed colleague here has a background, as a very sophisticated background in actuarial science. He understands, what a risk premium is. If I want to buy a desk today, and it's at a good price, I'm taking a risk by, locking up my money with you, waiting for that time to expire. Maybe the price of desks will go up. Maybe the value of my money will go down. It could go the opposite way, but that's a risk I'm taking. And we both know from behavioral science that people prefer a certain thing, even if it's necessary. Even if there's an expected value that could be better. If expected value is not a clear term, I don't want to get too technical on some of these things, but just there are so many things you have to commit to. There's so much calculus you have to commit to as the lender. You're giving over your money, and you're doing it so that without being able to access it, you're taking legal risk, you're taking effort, you have to gather the right people. And suppose this guy doesn't try and pay you back, or he tries to get out of paying you back. There's all these things which, as a lender, you're not going to freely give money without expecting some sort of compensation for the effort and the opportunity costs that are being presented. And this was true, and which is why we have ample evidence throughout all of history and civilization, ancient civilizations, all the way to modernity and contemporary society. All of them had interest-bearing loans, and for absolutely obvious reasons, because it's just rational. It's of course, it's how the world works. It's how you're going to get people to make loans, is the possibility and giving them the potential to make some more money off of their money. Otherwise, why would they do it? Because of all the reasons that we listed above. And even in medieval societies which were Christian, oftentimes they would import Jews just to use the Jews as this very concept of Deuteronomy 23 in order to enable liquidity markets. So time value of money it's a very fundamental pillar of economics and modern finance and everything, and it's simply logical. And so now we can appreciate, what was the Torah doing? What was God trying to do when he was teaching us against usury? It's right there in the text if you pay attention close enough. And Aquinas hits it a little bit, but we're coming at it from a different perspective slightly, and maybe we can talk about this more, which is that if you look in Exodus 22, Leviticus 25, Deuteronomy 23, the emphasis I've highlighted and read for you each time: my people, my brothers, your people, your brother, but your brother. What is the Torah trying to communicate? What is the message? The Nachmanides, one of the great early commentators of the medieval ages, medieval times. Anyway, he's explained it very well, right? Which is that the heathen's interest is permissible. This he did not mention with reference to robbery or theft. This is as the rabbis says that that theft from a heathen is forbidden. That is to say, like we said before, things which are morally wrong, those things are prohibited even to non-Jews. But borrowing for interest is something which both parties can agree to voluntarily. There's all those reasons why you should be allowed, as a lender, you should be incentivized to charge interest. But the Torah is demanding something higher of you. It wants you to go above and beyond that. For your brother, you're expected to go the extra mile. The Torah is teaching us the contours of what it means to be a brother and to treat somebody with compassion, right? And that's why that answers the question that we asked before. Why would God differentiate? If loaning with interest is an intrinsic moral wrong, then why would he permit it, but he would prohibit other things? Well, now we have a very good answer to that question, right? It's permitted because it's morally neutral. We established good reasons for why a lender should want to borrow with interest, but nonetheless, the Torah is going to demand that you take you answer to a higher calling when it comes to your neighbor and your brother. And the people who are not your neighbors and brothers, you don't have to act with such a high and higher degree of moral rectitude to deal with them. So yes, with your brother, yes, we're going to demand that you not lend with interest, despite all the logical reasons why you could. But when it comes to things like theft and murder, no. And similarly, you see this, it's the same through line through all these other topics where there's a differentiation in a hierarchy, right? Gossip can sometimes, if somebody wrongs you and you want to talk about it and say, hey, this person really wronged me, you're speaking the truth. What's wrong with that? Anybody could understand that it's true, but the Torah is going to demand for your brother, no, you have to be very careful with how you speak about other people, but we're not going to demand that of you. We're not going to demand that of you in when talking about people who are not within your covenant and your brotherhood. So, there's an idea that the whole Torah itself is really just a giant answer to this question of, am I my brother's keeper? The in-group, out-group distinction, it sounds less fair, but if you look at these distinctions, it's only in the areas where we're talking about morally neutral acts, a priori morally neutral acts, versus acts which are fair and which are demanding us to go above and beyond the call of duty. The world economy can't run without liquidity markets, but lending to your brother, come on, we're going to ask you to go above and beyond. So just revisiting Aquinas real quick, I'm telling you, I can see that I'm over time, so I'm not going to go into the Aristotle piece as much, although I do want to talk about Aristotle if time permits, because I do think he has a different perspective on this than what maybe a lot of us have considered. But we can now our questions now stand strong on Aquinas. I'm very curious to hear what Michael has to say, which is, God is not permitting evil. Why do we think that this is an evil thing? These verses don't seem to support his case, because you don't need to recapitulate Deuteronomy 23:21 later in texts, and to suggest that David was going against what the Torah wrote is very difficult to believe. Ezekiel, same thing, and Isaiah still feels highly relevant. I'm just going to jump over the Aristotle piece, although I would love to talk about it. But areas where I think we might be in agreement, Aquinas does kind of talk about how it's a violation of the concept of brotherhood, and I think that's very true of Judaism as well. And and maybe in a very bizarre hypothetical, obviously, but if the whole world were to convert to Judaism, then effectively, we would kind of have the exact similar situation, which I think Christianity kind of views humanity, which is to say that we're all a brotherhood of man. In which case, then loaning with interest would be effectively prohibited for everybody in the same way that Aquinas understands it. But we've arrived at it through a different perspective, right? And then, and I think also we have similar solutions. I just wanted to highlight that as well. There's a concept in halacha called the heter iska, which is a similar resolution to what I think I saw on Michael's website talk about how changing the incentive structure so that you could have loan, but you would also be assuming some of the risk. That's a similar solution that we do to meet the challenge, which is having to be able to create liquidity markets and having an interest-free law will ultimately will strangle any kind of liquidity. So that's it. I have some other slides as well for if need be, but we'll pause there. Thank you for your time, and hand it over to our moderator.
Thank you, Tractatus, for that opening statement. So now I'll pass things over to Michael for his opening statement.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate, first of all, that you take into account a lot of the Christian tradition with Aquinas and his reading of the scriptures. I have a bit more formal presentation that I wrote that I'll present, and then I'll attempt to answer some of the questions that you raised, which are very good questions, but I also think some of it is addressed in what I've written. So let me begin. Oh, and let me just sort of introduce myself. I'm Michael Humphreys. I have a background in physics and philosophy, and I've been working in finance for the past 11 years. And so I'm an actuary. And so I as Tractatus mentioned, I do have familiarity with a lot of these economic and financial concepts. And so in addition to the Christian background, that's kind of where I'm coming from and how I'm trying to reconcile them and bring them together. So in order to determine whether or not usury is a sin, we must first answer the question, what is usury? This is a difficult task if for no other reason than we have forgotten the purpose of exchange and the aim of justice in various transactions. Indeed, we will no doubt find it necessary in this debate to acknowledge the equivocal meanings of usury that each of us employs. Hence, it is necessary to begin by looking at the fundamental nature or essence of the act of usury. First and foremost, usury concerns the nature of commutations or contracts. Consequently, the evil of usury is tied to commutative justice, or justice in giving and receiving. Now, having worked for 11 years in finance, it's quite clear that there is an innumerable diversity of contracts determined by the multitude of ways that property rights can be structured, exchanged, and promised nowadays. To discover in what sort of contracts usury can be found, I will now turn briefly to the Christian tradition. If we look to the Old and New Testaments, we can see the progressive pedagogy of God with respect to usury. In the Pentateuch, God tolerates usury against foreigners, but firmly condemns it against one's neighbors. This is not because such a practice is just in itself, but rather to avoid the greater evils given the hardness of the hearts of men. And I'll return to this at the end. However, as St. Jerome notes, the prophet Ezekiel goes on to condemn all usury, not just that against one's neighbor, naming it alongside murder, adultery, and theft. Ultimately, with the coming of Jesus Christ, men are called to the fullness of evangelical perfection. He calls us not only to avoid exacting usury even against foreigners, but to lend hoping nothing in return. That is, we are not only not to profit from our lending, but not to hope even the principal returned. This act of lending is meant to help our neighbor in need, seeking his good, and consequently not seeking even the principal if the borrower is in worse shape than at the start. While Jesus shows us the holiness to which all men are called, the scriptures do not make it clear what sort of contract usury arises in. We have seen that it comes from loans, but there are many different ways of structuring loans. Fortunately, the church clarified this as early as the 4th century. St. Ambrose wrote a work against usury called the De Tabia. Before becoming Bishop of Milan, he studied Roman law and acted as a judicial counselor and provincial governor. Hence, he knew the law of contracts well. With this knowledge, he identified the scriptural condemnation of usury with the Roman law contract called the mutuum. We see this identification of usury with the mutuum again in the disciplinary disciplinary canons of the Council of Nicaea of the same century. The council expels the clergy engaged in usury, specifying the mutuum and the centesimus, that is, the legal rate of usury on a mutuum in the Roman Empire at the time. This connection is repeated again and again throughout the Christian tradition and canon law, the scholastics, councils, and popes, with the final encyclical on usury from Benedict XIV, Vix Pervenit, fixing the doctrine. Usury then has been consistently defined as a profit, any profit exacted from a mutuum contract. However, we have to clarify what exactly this mutuum loan is in order to understand why profiting from it is evil. Fortunately, the mutuum is as familiar to us as borrowing a cup of sugar from our neighbor to bake some cookies. In such a case, one has informally contracted a mutuum. However, in order to clarify this further, it will be worthwhile to distinguish different types of loans. We can generally define loans as granting the use of one's goods to another in order to receive them back later. The distinction of loans then follows from the sort of uses that one grants. In the case of a library loan, for example, which in the technical language of Roman law is a comodatum, the borrower can make use of the book for a time and return the very same book later. Now, the use granted is limited, as he is meant to read it, but not to sell or burn it, no matter how awful the author may be. That is, the borrower can use it in such a way as that he retains possession of it throughout, so as to return the very same book to the lender. On the other hand, one may borrow food to eat, wine to drink, or money to spend. These uses are quite different from the former. When one eats or drinks, one destroys the very thing he has eaten or drunk, and consequently is no longer in possession of it. When one spends money or sells any good whatsoever, he separates it from himself, losing possession of it as he transfers it to another. These uses, where the person loses possession of the good, are sometimes called consuming uses. When such a use is granted, one contracts a mutuum, but the very same good may not be able to be returned, having been consumed. Hence, the obligation of the debtor in a mutuum is not to return the very same thing lent, but something of the same kind and quality. What then does this have to do with usury? Well, the difference in the uses granted entails different structures of property rights and obligations. When the library grants the book to the borrower, it retains ownership of the book. It is for this reason that the borrower cannot sell or destroy the book, because he is not the owner. He only has a right to non-consuming uses of the book. For this reason, it is possible to exact some rent when a use of this kind is granted. When the lender receives back the book, he receives back the very thing that always had been his. But the use is something apart from this. Consequently, one can engage in an exchange of the use for a price, and thus instead of a gratuitous library loan, the lender can rent out the book as we see in textbook rentals. This logic falls apart in the case of the mutuum. When the lender grants a consuming use to the borrower, he passes full ownership of the thing. This is necessary because in order to use up or sell the thing, the borrower must be the owner of it. Otherwise, he would be violating the lender's rights and using it in this way. Consequently, the lender has no property claim to any specific thing, but rather a personal claim against the borrower for its return in some way. When the borrower uses up the good, all that is left is the person of the borrower. Here we can see in modern terminology that the mutuum is a personally secured loan, which are found in credit cards, student loans, and most car and home loans. And these are when the borrower himself is responsible for the return and not some piece of property. Now, at the end of the loan, when the borrower returns the thing lent in kind, he returns everything that the lender gave him. Here there is no separate use to charge for, because in giving the consuming use, the lender gave the whole thing. When he receives the whole thing back, he receives back everything he lent, thus satisfying his just claims. Consequently, to exact more is to take something more than he lent, either in trying to charge for the return of his his thing twice or to charge for what does not exist, namely the separate use. Thus, exacting something more than the return of the principal for a mutuum is unjust and a sin analogous to theft. Now, there is nothing specifically Christian about this argument, and it would hold just as well if you were a first century Roman pagan as it does for a 21st century Wall Street trader. The principles of just exchange and property have not changed, even as the descriptions or nomenclature have evolved over time. However, one implication of this argument is that, properly speaking, a personally secured loan can only be contracted as an act of charity. That is, since one cannot licitly take profit from such a loan, the only proper motivation is for the sake of the borrower himself. This aligns with the teaching of Jesus mentioned earlier, that we ought to lend for the sake of our neighbor. However, the immediate objection one hears, as we did, from economists, is that if we do not allow lending at usury, then no one would lend. While this may be true of the abstract homo economicus, it reveals man's fallen nature rather than the standards of justice. However, as I noted, the mutuum is specifically a personally secured loan. That is one where the borrower himself guarantees the return. Now, there are many ways of structuring loans, and the alternative would be an asset-secured or non-recourse loan. In these loans, the borrower does not personally secure the debt, but rather it is secured by some specific property. That is, if the borrower fails to repay, the lender can exact the return from those assets to fulfill the obligation, but only those assets. This includes the majority of business debt, such as corporate bonds, commercial paper, and other loans to limited liability companies. While this lending is not unobjectionable in every case, since it is not personally secured, it is ipso facto not usurious. In these sorts of loans, the lender holds a claim against the assets of the company, at least implicitly, which guarantees his principal. The interest, coupons, or rents that the lender receives can be described in various ways depending on the structure of the contract, but they are derived or indexed to some property itself. In contrast, the personally secured loan has no specified property that the loan is connected to, which entails that the usurer derives his rent-like payments from the person of the borrower himself. However, what can economics and finance itself tell us about usury? First, I'll argue that economics and finance lack the proper categories to reject usury by their own modes of reasoning. However, this also entails that economics and finance cannot show that usury is morally good or licit on their own. They can only show that the usurer prefers or values his usuries, or otherwise pragmatic for some economic or financial ends, rather than being just per se. However, exacting usury does contradict the fundamental axioms that such sciences rest upon, namely exchange and property. The evil of usury arises from the manner in which ownership and different sorts of use can be lent. Consequently, to admit usury in principle is to deny the nature and structure of property. However, apart from the existence and nature of property, economics cannot proceed beyond mere consumption. If we cannot ensure that these things are mine, my property, and thus not to be taken by another, that I can legally hold them against another, there is no reason for me to accumulate goods for my long-term needs, as they can be merely taken. Moreover, there is also no reason for me to create productive capital, such as a field or a dam, because this too can be taken or disposed of by another. Nevertheless, usury is not just immoral, but it is economically unstable and financially bad business. The fundamental nature of usurious debt is that it is ultimately secured by a person. Now, debts may be partially secured by some collateral, but when the assets do not cover the whole principal, the lender can pursue the borrower's personal assets and wages. Now, when personal guarantees enter such contracts, it is usually because there is some issue with the capital structure, that the assets can't guarantee the principal and interest on their own, and thus the lender has to rely upon personal guarantees in addition to the assets. A further issue is the consideration of proper risk management and economic stability. When banks are required to underwrite loans that are fully secured by assets rather than including personal guarantees, they are strongly incentivized to ensure the quality and valuation of those assets. A self-interested bank will be more likely to maintain healthy underwriting standards and loan-to-value ratios because the collateral is all they have to fall back onto. The reverse of this was what we saw in the case of the 2008 financial crisis, as most of the loans were personally secured. Apart from serious fraud, loan-to-value ratios exceeded 100% and underwriting standards often dissolved. This created a dangerous environment where, when borrowers can't pay en masse, collateral values collapse, loans go underwater, and the financial system becomes endangered and the economy with it. Moreover, we have empirical evidence as to the advantages of non-usurious lending. After the 2008 financial crisis, the economic recovery depended in part on whether a jurisdiction was strongly non-recourse or personally secured. In Europe, where loans were generally personally secured, they saw a slower recovery relative to the United States' relatively non-recourse regime. And even in the United States, those states with explicit non-recourse laws, which effectively exclude usurious home loans, saw faster recovery than states with personally secured loans. The reason for this is that after the crash in personally secured regimes, consumers remained obligated to repay the principal. This reduced the aggregate consumption in the economy as more income had to be allocated to repaying the loans, leading to a slower recovery. On the other hand, those non-recourse regimes saw a harder crash but a faster recovery, as consumers could more quickly return to pre-crisis levels of consumption. The possibility of this harder crash is a warning to lenders to be more prudent with their lending, maintain higher underwriting standards, if for no other reason than their self-preservation, thus improving the economic stability. Thus, from the perspective of ethics, usury is contrary to justice and a sin abhorred by God and men for millennia. However, from the economic and financial perspective, it is bad business. Personal guarantees are a sign that there is a problem with the lending structure, but also such guarantees can hinder the recovery of an economy after crisis. Thus, while economics and finance lack the categories to exclude usurious loans outright, they can still judge them to be generally imprudent. And so I'll pause there before attempting to answer some of these questions raised by Tractatus to see where we should go next first.
Thank you for that introduction, Michael. Perhaps to maybe help those of us who are not like experts in finance. You know, I sometimes have a lot of trouble as I'm working through material on your blog, for example, trying to figure out what these different types of loans are and so on. It seems, if I understand your introduction correctly, that the key issue is that the loans need to be secured by some sort of actual thing. Otherwise, it's going to be anchored on the person. You're essentially enslaving the person through that debt, and it ends up becoming unjust. Am I understanding you correctly?
That is a way of describing it. It's kind of a species of the more generic notion of slavery, because it does index that to the person himself rather than some property.
Yeah, perhaps it might be helpful then to start off with this question of what is the definition of usury? Because I think we're seeing here a slight disagreement on what the definition is. So I'm curious, Tractatus, if you agree with the Catholic understanding of what the nature of this sin is.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty clear we're definitely at odds here, and I think that the issue kind of comes to the. It seems to me that you guys create a category of usury, and you're kind of it. How should I say this? The definition you define it as evil, but and then you kind of assume the conclusion in doing so by and I haven't yet heard an answer to the question which I posed to you before, and this would help me understand it better, Michael, which is when you have two people, in the field and they come to each other, and this one is looking to spend his money on a desk, but instead is being asked now to give a loan, and the borrower, is asking the lender, well, I wouldn't want you to be, to go uncompensated, and I'd be happy to, to compensate you for, by in the way of paying interest. What is the moral problem with that? What, just addressing that question in the abstract from your perspective.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways that you can kind of break down that category. So, for example, there's nothing morally problematic, for example, with someone saying, "Hey, if you lend to me, and I'm capable of it, I will give you something extra at the end of the day." What the problem of usury arises from is when there's an actual obligation to pay some sort of interest. So it's not merely like, "Hey, I need some money. Will you lend to me?" But it's, "Hey, I need money. And you're going to exact interest from me." So it becomes a sort of civil obligation. And so even from Aquinas's perspective, there is a distinction between civil and what he calls moral or maybe honest or virtuous obligations. And so when someone lends to you, the civil obligation is only to return the amount of principal given, but there is still a moral obligation of friendship to, return gratitude and praise to your benefactor, and potentially also to give him a gift if you are capable to express that gratitude. And so, from my perspective, as long as the lender doesn't obligate him to require him to pay interest, it's not problematic for the borrower to offer something freely, though, and that would be the distinction. And it has to do with this nature of the contract, is that if the charge is built into the contract itself, there's no justification for it because there's nothing in addition to what was given that he can charge for.
So, okay, so great. So one observation and then two follow-on questions for you then. So first off, I'll just be clear, in Jewish law, that actually is prohibited. So if you were to offer a gift outside of the contract or to, like I said, to put information, etc., these are things that are going to still be like, you're not biblically prohibited from doing so, but it is rabbinically prohibited because the rabbis were so concerned about this issue of usury. So you're not even allowed to do that according to Torah law, because you could come onto, the appearance of what's called avak ribis, which is to say it has the appearance of ribis. So that's definitely a point of distinction between our two faiths, which I think is interesting.
I will agree there that distinction, though, was often abused. Like there's all sorts of ways that lenders would hide interest, and so him quote unquote freely giving a gift could still be usury if tacitly they had an agreement between them, like, "Oh, hey, I'll lend to you if you pay me X, but we're going to call it a gift."
Yeah, and to be clear too, and just to put put in the spirit of kind of putting all cards on the table, there are even within the Jewish framework, there is an exposure to a sort of runaround, and the rabbis tried to do their best to accomplish this, right? But because of the nature of allowing for interest to be to be able to lend with interest to non-Jews, one could do essentially what like the British did, like King Edward did, with the Jews in back in like a medieval England in like the 1200s, where they used basically they brought the Jews and they would lend, and then they would just tax the Jews. The Jews could apply usury to the Gentiles, and then the crown could tax the Jews, and so you could create this runaround. The same thing happens actually, in Jewish society, where it's like, well, I'll just lend first to a non-Jew, and then or I'll borrow from the non-Jew and then lend on his behalf. Now they try to curtail that behavior, but that is a problem. But getting back to the question I wanted to ask you, which I think is, which is like, so you say the problem is when you put it into the contract, that's what makes it a problem. But two questions. First is, if and this again, I want to be clear, this is prohibited according to Torah law. The borrower is not allowed to incentivize or come of his own volition and say, well, I don't care about that. Don't worry. You can charge me interest. You're not allowed to do that from the borrower's perspective. You would still be you as the borrower would be violating a Torah prohibition and would be punished, accordingly, in the laws of heaven. But what the categorical distinction here of just putting it just as soon as you put it into the contract versus doing something outside of the contract, as a verbal commitment and an expression of gratitude, why should that rationally make any distinction? And then the second question is, again, the consideration of what the lender is like. I've got a desk here, I could buy it today, and you're asking me to forego that. I want to get this. I need this desk because my old desk is not great, but I can see that you need a loan. And I'm now in a situation where I'm foregoing buying this desk, which I can pay for, and I think it's a fair price. And there's a possibility, there's a risk in the future that the price of the desk will be higher, the value of my money will be lower. It could go the opposite direction, of course, and as I'm sure you're well aware, there's an idea of like a risk premium associated with this uncertainty and this volatility in that could exist in the desk market. And me foregoing the use and the ability to use my own money now is something which is why I'm people from time immemorial have wanted to be compensated for that. So it seems like we're ignoring what the lender is being asked to forego, and I want to understand from you why that is not, it doesn't seem like that's being addressed in the framework that you presented in your introduction.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll answer the second one because I think that's the more interesting one, and we can come back to the first if you're still dissatisfied. But the way I would kind of approach that is that there is a distinction between the justification for a charge and the valuation of a charge. And so within his own subjective valuation, he might consider all sorts of things of, what I'm losing out on, what are the potential risks, what are all these things that go into it. And, I really want this, I'm missing out. And so you have all these notions of risk premium, and he could even talk about, his time preference, that he won't be able to use the desk and so forth and so on. And so these are all concerned with different questions of valuation, of how he determines how much this is worth to him. But this is what I was getting at in terms of the reason why economics and finance can't get to the morally good or licit is because it's determined with valuation from the perspective of sort of this motivation to do something. And so this is distinguished from the justification for the charge. And so what actually grounds the charge in the first place? And so, for example, we can consider a thief who has some sort of good that he has stolen. And we can apply all sorts of valuations to it. He's not going to have it, he's going to have a risk, and so forth and so on. But his sale from the start is invalid because he is not the owner. And so there's no justification for any charge in the first place. And this is exactly the case in usury, is that all of the questions of valuation don't really resolve down to what is justified. What is the source of the charge? What is the reason? What is being valued in the first place? And so that is the distinction that I would make as to why, this sort of considerations do not apply in this case, is because there's no justification for a charge to be applying valuation to.
But you acknowledge, though, that these are legitimate concerns from the perspective of the lender, and you even create a category by which you can secure a loan against collateral. And you made a very interesting argument, which I would have to give a lot more thought to, about how economic recovery from the 2008 financial collapse was tied to kind of like more, I guess, optimized loans from the perspective of Catholicism versus those that aren't. I haven't seen the data, so I can't lend comment to that. But it seems to me then that there's still this question where it's like, you said it comes down to a matter of value, but then but we're kind of drawing an arbitrary fence around what is under consideration in and I don't understand why the debtors, why the lenders time preferences and risk premiums, etc., are not, and his that calculus which weighs upon him is not being allowed into the definition. And that's why, to me, that's why I'm saying it's like begging the category by categorization. We're just it seems like we're constructing an artificial category. The lender's consideration is what we should be attempting to understand, precisely because the Torah is telling us that it's not, when we're getting down to brass tacks now, where it's like, okay, so what is the moral issue at hand? And are you then implying that God was not, was permitting immoral acts to take place? And then by extension, the same question that I posed in the introduction, why is it that, theft was prohibited for between Jews and Gentiles, but then he's permitting this one? Why the inconsistency? Sorry if that was too many questions thrown at once. You can take that however you please. I realize I can't hear myself.
Yeah, so I'll take the first one. I'm going to strongly push back and say this is not an arbitrary distinction, because when we look at the case of the lease, as I noted, one of the things we note is that when we return there's a distinction in the lease, which is a different sort of loan than the mutuum, in that when we return the very thing, there's actually two obligations. There's the return of the thing lent, and then there's the rent for the use of the thing. And so, for example, if you leased a book in a textbook rental, if the book itself and its price were to have dropped, let's say, for example, that it's discovered that this book is just generated by AI, the author perjured him or herself, and so the value of the book just collapsed after you had leased it. Now, when you return the very same book, you do not owe that person more or less because that book is more or less valuable. The 100%. The category is you return the very same thing. And so The rent, though, is coming from the use as something apart from the return of the very same thing. But in the mutuum, you have returned the very same thing, and there is no use separate from that. So that is for me, that is a clear categorical distinction. Now, I'll pause there before I go to the scripture question, though.
Yeah. So okay. Well, let's hover on that for just a second, though, because I don't dispute that there's a major legal distinction between rental and between a rent and a loan. A borrowed object is and the Torah and the Halacha have a very similar perspective in that regard. Like we view these as totally separate categories of law, and they're taught in totally. I mean, they're all in one basic tractate called Bava Metzia, which is a long and dense legal discourse. But the section that deals with loans is separate and distinct from rentals. So we're on the same page there. But what I'm still trying to get at, though, is the lenders, and again, this is all speaking in the hypothetical of just two people coming together and civilization in general having a understanding that a lender is going to only be interested in making the loan, if he's going to be compensated for the sacrifices that he's taking with his time and with his, with the risk associated with what he was going to, potentially be using for the money for otherwise, legal risk of having to, maybe chase down this person who, the borrower who might not be so interested in having to repay, all these different aspects. Yeah, there's an understanding why they would want to be incentivized, and for us to not acknowledge that or to somehow demean it and say it's immoral because they have these considerations, that to me, I still don't hear a strong rational reason for why that's the case. And that rational reason is why we have a distinction in Judaism, because we understand those are legitimate, but the Torah is bringing you to a higher calling when it comes to your brother. So can you, maybe I'm just missing the point, but maybe you can restate. I feel bad if at this point people feel like I'm just kind of retreading over the same point over and over again, but maybe you can state it again one more time.
No, I think those are fair questions. And for me, from the rational perspective, it's the question of what exactly is being exchanged. So when you sacrifice things, when you're giving it up, when you're not having these opportunities, you're not giving me that. It's the same as in the case of the lease. When you lease it to me, you're not giving me your not having it, your sacrifices, the things you could have done with it. You're giving me the use of the thing. And so those may fall into the valuation of that use as you consider it, but those aren't things that are actually entering into the contract, because what you're giving me is the thing itself. And so that's why I don't think that sort of falls into the sort of consideration that you are wanting, because it's like, well, I'm giving up this future use. I'm giving up these things I could have done with it. Well, okay, but those aren't things you're giving me. What you're giving me is this apple, this money, this X, Y, or Z.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I understand that point. I get that, like, the borrower does not derive the value. That's value that's essentially, I agree, it's burned in a sense because it's being foregone by the act of the lender. But we have this, there's no, but what I think is kind of interesting, though, is that you did acknowledge previously that that expressing gratitude, that offering a gift, then is considered commendable. So there is a recognition, even if it's not commensurate with whatever value we would derive using whatever calculus, to time value the money and, free cash flow, calculations, what have you. Like, there's still, a recognition of the value lost, but then and in a willingness, and you said that, it's even praiseworthy to ascribe that, but then it becomes illicit as soon as you make it part of the contract itself. So it seems like you're almost acknowledging, though, that value is being lost, and that it is virtuous to try and compensate somebody for it. But the objection is only to make that contractual. That to me is very interesting. It's not, I wouldn't say, an outright contradiction in terms, but it does seem like the two values are at odds with each other, because you're denying the value at one stage but acknowledging it in another.
Yeah, so I would acknowledge that, or the distinction I would draw would be that as a matter of commutative justice, it's not something that the borrower can be obligated to pay for, because it is not something that he receives. But as a matter of liberality or friendship, that might be taken into account. But really, it's really the gratitude that is being expressed is for the benefit that one has received, because not to sort of compensate him for the loss, but to express that gratitude. Because, as you're noting throughout all of this is has to do. And so this is an act of charity towards him. And so acknowledging that through some means, whether that's through just a verbal expression of gratitude or, a freely given gift, to acknowledge that is in a different category, because it's not something that is obligated legally as a matter of commutative justice, but is an act of friendship and liberality.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point you make about this act of charity, and I'm curious to maybe hear a little bit more. What I guess would be so this is an area where halakha also has this distinction, where I think there's a perceived difference between kind of a personal loan and a business loan. Now, at the end of the day, we don't really draw that distinction so clearly, but there are classic commentators, Rashi for one, in the Gemara in Baba Metzia, that describes how the kind of prohibition might only, it's not so obvious, but it might be saying that there's a difference between a business loan and a personal loan. And ultimately, I think we come out not really acknowledging that, or not differentiating in that area. There are ways in which we do create what's called the Heter Iska, which I described earlier. But in terms of distinguishing between business loans and personal loans, and then kind of touching on what you just said about charity, right? The thing is that it's kind of a recognition that sometimes a loan is being done because the person is in a very tight situation financially and needs some cash, and this is just giving him his daily bread to be able to, and he's going to have to figure out how he's going to repay you because things are so financially tight, and having a sensitivity to that reality can be different than somebody seeking a business loan, and you were describing securing say a financial loan for a business against the assets of the business. Maybe there's a distinction there that you can kind of re-emphasize, because I don't think it was as clear to me as well. But ultimately, sometimes those two realms can kind of blur, right? With a sole proprietor, and the Torah doesn't necessarily have the same kind of legal entities that we have today, limited liability corporate, companies and corporations, and creating kind of distance between entities. But maybe you could kind of speak a little bit more about how you might view the business loan as distinct from the personal loan, and whether or not there's room to differentiate there, and how kind of canon and I guess Catholicism treats those topics.
Yeah, one of the big kind of, I won't call it a loan, but it's more like business financing, especially in the Middle Ages, was called the societas. And this often took the form of a working partner who might be a merchant or might be an artisan, might own a business, and he's looking for money. And so someone with money comes in and offers to finance that business. For example, a merchant going to the Middle East to trade and return to maybe buy silk from the Middle East and then trade it in France or something like that. And so the financing involved in that would be, and then the financer is more of a silent partner. And so this was sometimes presented as sort of a business loan. But the distinction would be that in the societas, you would have a sharing of the risks and a sharing of the gains and losses. And so in that sense, it wasn't strictly the sort of loan where the borrower would receive, or the lender would receive back his principal no matter what. So he took part in that risk. And so the way to think of that in distinction from the mutuum is that the silent partner or the financier has a ownership claim in that business, in those goods being bought and sold. And so he shares in the buying and the selling and the profits. And so there's a sort of a shared profit there. But it wasn't something that was necessarily guaranteed. And so they shared both profits and losses. And so if the business failed or didn't achieve even the amount initially financed, they would share those losses. And so that was one example. Another example, which is represented in the actual doctrinal statements from the Catholic perspective, is the census contract. And so this has more of a character of a loan, is that I don't want to call him a lender, but the purchaser would come to someone who owns a farm, for example. And so the farmer would promise him some amount of the yield of the farm and the per year, and the purchaser would give him some money up front. So you have very much that structure of like an annuity where you pay up front and then you receive sort of annual income afterwards. But the distinction there between a mutuum and the census contract was that it was always tied to the census itself, or the underlying base property, so the farm. And so he may agree to so much crops per year, or monetary in-kind payments. And if he failed to pay those payments could go into arrears, or he'd have to pay them, make up for those payments later. But if ultimately he couldn't pay at all, the purchaser of the census could only go after the value of the farm itself. So oftentimes this was considered to be like the purchaser buying what's called a usufruct, so a claim to the fruits of the property, and then sort of renting that back to the owner. And so that's where he sort of derived his rents. And so there's that property claim that grounds it, that sort of justifies those rent-like payments. And then ultimately his ability to derive it from the property, come what may. So those are kind of the two big ones that were largely discussed in the Catholic tradition, and how they were structured in such a way that it was really grounded in the nature of the property that really distinguishes it from the sort of mutuum loan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. For the sake of, I guess, kind of giving a slightly more spicy exchange, I want to kind of drive back now to the kind of the biblical verses, specifically that Aquinas had raised in support. And I want to kind of reissue my questions because I feel like I didn't hear a response, and I don't quite understand, why he is suggesting that Psalm 14, because and Ezekiel, you kind of supplied an answer a little bit to the Ezekiel thing, although I'd still push back and say that whole passage in 18 is only speaking about, is only speaking to Israel, about Israel. As I mentioned, if you just go through the whole chapter, he's only talking to Israel. So there's no reason that we should necessarily infer that it's speaking in generality. Beyond what you had mentioned, which is, oh, look, there's, it's also talking about adultery and it's talking about, murder. But again, those are, can just be principally and easily understood as just referring to Israel itself, amongst Israel, which was the issue that he was, that he specifically is having. Not to say that they aren't, forbidden in general, but in this case, we have no reason to suspect that he's trying to broaden the law. And specifically, going back to Psalm 14/15, which is David doesn't re-mention a particular aspect of the law, but like he doesn't mention multiple aspects of the law, right? And there's one aspect of the law which is that it's not just currency, but also any type of a commodity, and that doesn't get mentioned again either. But I don't think Aquinas would suggest that that undoes that somehow changes or modifies that prohibition because he failed to recapitulate it in a poem. And so I'm curious how you understand that textual argument that he's making, both with regard to Psalms and Ezekiel, Yechezkel and Tehillim for the Jewish listeners, obviously.
Yeah, so I'll begin by noting that I don't have the sort of biblical or theological aptitude to make an extended argument on these. And first of all, I'll note from, Aquinas's perspective, he's writing the Summa for other Christians. And so he's carrying with him the sort of context of the reading of the church fathers and some of this other context with it. So I don't think he would necessarily present it in that particular way were he to be arguing with a Jew, for example. But to your question about the sort of permission or toleration in Deuteronomy is it really, I think it comes down to the different ways in which we understand the law and what it does and does not tolerate, because you're quite right that murder is absolutely forbidden, and this is indeed necessary, but it's consistent with the way that Aquinas thinks as well, because there are certain evil acts that make society impossible in itself, but there are certain acts which, while not just in themselves, can be tolerated for the sake of the common good and the preservation of society. And so this is how I would think he would read Deuteronomy, is that God is tolerating this against the foreigners because but condemning it against the Israelites, because were it tolerated against the Israelites, it would make society impossible. But against foreigners, it doesn't undermine society in the same way. And so that's one potential way that I could think of it. Now, the questions of, the sort of detailed biblical analysis of, Psalm 15 or Ezekiel, I can't necessarily answer, because it does seem, and, perhaps there is an argument there that it is unqualified, but he leaves other things unqualified as well. And that's a reasonable, I think, interpretation, but it leaves the question ambiguous more than anything. So it's not definitive one way or the other. Did I answer all your questions?
To some degree. I mean, obviously we're not going to be reading the. I guess the difficulty that I have with the way that he analyzes or moves from Deuteronomy onto Psalms into Ezekiel, partially has to do with, kind of the notion that David in his Psalms would be somehow countermanding the Mosaic law. That which was previously permitted is now being prohibited in David's time, or in Yechezkel or Ezekiel's time. To me, is an interesting innovation, and I understand that Christians, though, have a whole different way of kind of viewing the scriptures and the Hebrew Bible, and often look to it in kind of a Christological perspective, where they view it, as kind of being unmoored from, I guess, the legal norms of the Mosaic law to some degree. But I do still, the one point that you did make, which I do want to push back on a little bit, is with regard to this idea of, like where you made a distinction where you said like murder and theft could not be tolerated. And I can understand that perspective as well. I think that's even a strong argument to some degree. However, I don't think that's the argument that Aquinas himself was making, right? Because he had, going back to his precise language, he said that, they were only being allowed, I'll just read it out. Let's say they were permitted, however, to take usury from foreigners, not as though it were licit, but in order to avoid a greater evil, lest to wit, through avarice, to which they are prone, according to Isaiah 56:11. I have dislodged my objections to that quote, but they should take usury from Jews who were worshipers of God. And it sounds like he's making a different argument than you, which is to say that he's concerned about, lest they, it's being permitted, lest they come onto a more severe crime because somehow God, because the Israelites are God worshiping. But that seems to me to be at odds with the principal objection that he has, which is that the Catholicism has, which is that it's prohibited in general. Why should it seems like those two reasons are kind of contradicting each other, at least the way I understand it. Maybe you have a different perspective.
No, I'll admit I don't have a definitive answer on this, and so the way that I understand it is that it is, tolerated in the same sense that, divorce is tolerated in the old law, but in the new, Jesus tells us that, the two become one flesh. And so there's no divorce in remarriage. And this is allowed for, divorce was allowed for the hardness of men's hearts. And I suspect that the logic behind the worshipers of God probably has to do with that notion of brotherhood and justice towards one's brother, and the orientation of society and the peace of society. And so you have the Israelites, or Israel, which is a foreshadowing of the Christian church. And so one ought not to take from one's brother in that sense, for the sake of the common good of the people of God. But once we obtain to the Christian era, we see that all men are brothers, and there is a universal brotherhood, because with the coming of Christ, all men are at least potentially Christians, and at least potentially in the church. So that might be part of it, but again, I lack the sort of theological and scriptural aptitude to be able to really drill down into probably the nuts and bolts of what's all going on there.
I'll invoke my moderator's privilege here to ask a question that I think might bring out some interesting points on it, which is I've seen some Christian commentators suggest that if you look at the way it's phrased in Exodus, there's simply a prohibition on lending to brothers. And it's in Deuteronomy, which would be after they spent this 40 years in the wilderness and they've had more failures, that there's an addition Moses makes in Deuteronomy that gives permission to lend to foreigners, where that was ambiguous before in Exodus. And as well, if I remember correctly, the allowance of divorce is added in Deuteronomy as well. So the idea is that Jesus sort of removed some of these concessions that Moses made in Deuteronomy, such as on usury and on divorce, that were not necessarily fully intended originally in Exodus. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, Tractatus.
Yeah, I mean, well, for sure, we would push back against that. We view that the Torah is one complete work. There is, of course, an interesting discussion to be had for sure in terms of what laws were re-taught, which laws were kind of brought forward in Deuteronomy that weren't necessarily previously explicit in Exodus and Leviticus. But from a Torah Jewish perspective, all of the laws were for sure taught at Sinai, and the reiteration of them took place over the subsequent 40 years in the desert. The writing of some of the laws that didn't necessarily make it into Exodus and to to Leviticus and to Numbers are not necessarily indicative of the fact that they weren't always present to begin with. It's just being stated later, but not to be viewed as concessions. God forbid that would, to me, just like provide some moral intuition for that. It doesn't, the idea that Moses is going to like have a carve out to the Israelites, and they pushed, they lobbied him for some liberalities because they were not, so interested in adhering to the law that God laid down. It's a very difficult, I mean, certainly they get criticized. We get criticized for being a stiff-necked people. That notwithstanding, the acceptance of the law was total. Nasev and Nishma, they say, we will do it and then we will understand. They were fully committed to the Torah, and there was no need to modify and change things based on their circumstance. Now, there are a couple of examples where what I'm saying is true in general, but and I don't want to take us too far off of a tangent. That's not to say that there aren't interesting cases to be studied, like with the daughters of Salafchad, towards the end of Numbers, when certain laws had to be clarified in terms of inheritance and tribal inheritance and things like that. There is some nuance in that conversation, but by and large, when we're talking about things like the institution of divorce and the institution of interest, as I've previously stated, we don't have to come on to such hypotheses, because I feel like we're very grounded in our perspective. Like, we don't, I think Michael has done a very good job of trying to articulate the Catholic perspective, which is that the value can't be kind of imputed or the value for the lender cannot be kind of imputed into the calculus of the loan itself. I can understand that perspective, but the Jewish perspective, I think, is just as valid, which is to say that that you can't ignore that that value in general, which is the rationalization for why it's permitted to lend to non-Jews. We don't view it as fundamentally sinful. We view it as a morally neutral calculus, and therefore, and what the Torah is asking you to do is to go above and beyond, for the people who are your brothers, and that's I think, and it's a noble calling, and I think it's a very powerful notion of what divine ethics looks like. Because if you think about just what society was from time immemorial, nobody, not the Romans, not the Greeks, not the the Parthians, or any of these ancient civilizations, the Chinese, the Indian. I mean, like everywhere everywhere we have an archaeology, we have loans with interest. And I think the Torah, this topic is so fascinating because it was such a radical notion to have a society that's governed through loans, which does not charge interest and explicitly forbids it, and recognizes that there is this frailty of humanity and the desire to understand that, like, there sometimes a loan is a business loan, like we were talking about, but sometimes a loan is a personal loan, and you have to be sensitive to your brother. You have to understand and appreciate where his life is at, and that means forgoing interest sometimes, and even though it might be permitted in other circumstances, but when it comes to your brother, it's telling you something very, very valuable. So I drifted a little bit from answering your question and back into the main topic, but hopefully that the first part at least answered what you had posed. But let me know if not.
Well, one thing that I would like to address quite quickly is, so I can happily acknowledge that lending at interest has appeared throughout the world, but it has not appeared unobjectionably everywhere. It's not as if Christians have been opposing this, because Cato the Younger, for example, a Roman pagan, says, "What is usury?" Well, what is murder? And so he compares the two quite explicitly. And Aristotle and Plato both condemn usury. And so this isn't something that is unobjectionable even to non-Christians and non-Jews. So it may be everywhere, but prostitution has also been everywhere. So it's not, this in itself is not a good reason to accept it as something morally licit generally.
Yeah, that's a great point, which is why I've had to. Okay, so there's a couple of points there, so I just want to respond. So the first is, of course, that the last point first, which is that I agree. Yes, evidence of prostitution has also, as an institution, has also been present throughout history. That's a very accurate point. However, that's why we have to have this discussion precisely about what is is it a morally neutral act, or is it a morally evil act to do without? And so long as we have a clear rationalization for the justification of loaning with interest, we can then back into that and try and understand why the Torah would permit it, because ultimately, we're bumping up against this issue of like God, permitting, people to engage in this behavior, and coming on to this idea that God is going to allow something which he believes privately to be evil is, to me, is still a very, very weird tension that one would have to kind of wrestle with. But the other point, shoot, I'm sorry, your other point was not just the prostitution, but so the Aristotle and the other philosophers recognizing it. Yeah, so I think, by the way, this kind of goes, I was hoping we were eventually going to get back to this, but when I looked at Aristotle, I was really trying to understand his words, and I sometimes think that maybe people misunderstand, and this is obviously my own conjecture, and I realize I'm kind of going on my own here, but when I read what he has to say, I was kind of struck by a couple of things. First, obviously, there's the place where he condemns it in politics, and let me just pull up the quote to make sure. In Politics, chapter 10, book 1, chapter 10, right? But he says his critique of it, and is very interesting, where he says, "But interest increases the amount of money itself, and this, and consequently, this form of business of getting wealth is of all forms the most contrary to nature." And what I find interesting about that comment is first of all, the first part of the sentence makes a little bit, it almost makes no sense on a literal sense, right? Because you're not making money out of nothing. This is just an exchange of existing currency. Like nobody's going to the mint and printing new money as part of these transactions, and that's obvious. Obviously Aristotle understood that. So what do I think his objection? And then what I think is also interesting, though, is that he does kind of talk about loans again in Nicomachean Ethics, and apologies if I butchered the pronunciation of that word. But he over there, he talks about loans, and he's talking about justice, and he doesn't raise the idea that loans are problematic, or he doesn't raise the issue of usury there, and that would be like the perfect time to do it. And I was thinking that maybe what Aristotle's real objection to was not necessarily usury itself, but finance as a lifestyle, as a means of gainful employment, where and I think it's kind of almost like a condemnation of the financial class, to a certain extent, where he's saying like this is not how people should be making the money, right? Like when you had to go for gainful employment, you should be contributing to the economy in a way that's not just interacting with the medium of exchange. The medium of exchange is just a conduit by which people are able to exchange goods and services in an efficient manner. And people who get like wrapped up in it, in this, and just like, well, I can just loan and I can get more money for that, and then I'm just like synthesizing money from money. That I feel like is maybe what he's kind of describing to some degree, in politics, right? That consequently, this form of business of getting wealth is of all forms most contrary to nature, because he doesn't want people to be, engaged in this behavior. He wants them to be, engaged in life itself, as opposed to this, this kind of this form of just making that your main business. Now, I obviously, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience might be saying, well, isn't that what Jews are doing? Which is, it's just maybe a fair and interesting conversation to have, like why there's so much affinity between Jews and finance. But independently, I think that might, be his criticism, as opposed to the idea that he finds it objectively incorrect, because, he lived obviously with, usury existed in Greek society, and I don't see in Nicomachean ethics any kind of condemnation of it there, even though he's talking about the same topic and talking specifically about justice with regard to these kind of contractual relationships. So anyway, just food for thought. You guys can object to that or say I'm crazy.
No, I think they're actually fairly good insights. And I actually have a whole podcast devoted to Aristotle's theory of usury in the politics. And what I'll say is that part of the issue is getting the proper context of how he understands money and the acquisition of money, because to that he also condemns commercial trade as well as unnatural. And so really what I think he's getting at, if you look to the prior chapter, is he's acknowledging the way in which seeking money for its own sake undermines society, because money is not true wealth, and so it doesn't have an end in itself. So when you buy an apple, you buy an apple and then you eat it. You don't need to buy another apple after that until you're hungry again. But with money, because it's seen as the true wealth and you can obtain anything with it, you seek it for its own sake and then accumulate more and more money without end. And this leads to a number of issues that he notices. So people will seek just money to satisfy their passions instead of seeking some sort of rational end. It turns the virtues against themselves. For example, instead of courage being used to battle or to, seek victory in battle, it's turned towards taking riskier trades to make more money. And it also leads the arts to be perverted as well. So one doesn't do medicine to seek the health of the patient, but to just seek more money. And these are all sort of things that I think are in our own society empirical observations. So it's well known, the pharmaceutical companies being concerned with maximizing profits rather than seeking people's health. People who are very, brave or courageous in making greater and greater trades just to make more money, who are otherwise incredibly avaricious and vicious. And so for him, the seeking of money for its own sake is deeply problematic, because it undermines society, it undermines the virtues, it undermines the arts. One way of that is commercial exchange, which is for profit itself. Now, I've read through it several times. I think there is some allowance for, commercial exchange, not for profit as the end in itself, but for further ends, which is the point Aquinas makes in his Summa, but that's beside the point. And then usury is something in addition to that. It's just another way of seeking money for itself. And it's worse than commercial trade because in commercial trade, at least you're exchanging goods for money. And so you're actually providing for the needs of people. Whereas with usury, you're just making more money from just using money. So that's the kind of way that I've argued to read it. And it does align, I think, with some of your insights about how we ought to live, financially. But yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad that we were able to find that level of agreement. And I didn't know that you also had a podcast. I didn't see that in your Twitter profile or see the WordPress. I have it open. Maybe you'll share that with me after the debate. But anyway, I feel like we've kind of run through the topics at this point. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. I don't know, Gideon, from your perspective, are there more questions that you wanted to pose? I feel like we've gotten a good lay of the land.
Yes, thinking maybe we could go to a few audience questions, just to sort of wrap things up here. I first just wanted to comment on the point Michael made earlier about Cato the Younger, because I remember in a Latin course we were reading Cato the Elder's on agriculture, and he had a funny line about usury I thought I would read. It's right near the beginning of On Agriculture, where he says, "Our ancestors held this view and embodied it in their laws, which required that the thief be punished double and the usurer fourfold. How much less desirable a citizen they considered the usurer than the thief, one may judge from this." And he goes on the rest of the work to then praise what he considers the real life of like how someone ought to work, which is on agriculture instead of in the trades. But anyways, I wanted to ask you, Tractatus, a question about your initial presentation, where you said that according to Judaism, the lending of interest is a morally neutral act. But it seems to me, from looking here at the Mishneh Torah, and I haven't looked at this in detail, but Maimonides seems to have a little bit stronger of a view, because he has here, it's in the positive mitzvot number 199, and I'm reading from Safaria's translation here. It has to lend to a Gentile at interest, as Deuteronomy states, take interest from a Gentile. Based on the oral tradition, we have learned this is a positive commandment. So it seems Maimonides thinks there's actually an obligation to lend at interest to a Gentile. And is that the case, or am I misunderstanding him?
No, you're not. So there's definitely that perspective, and it's. Let me put it this way. I have to like. How should I think about it? Let me gather my thoughts for a second. Okay, so like this, there's within the Shulchan Aruch on an unrelated but kind of related topic, and I forget the chapter off the top of my head, but there's a prohibition against. So there's another commandment, similar kind of scheme to what we've been talking about, called the returning of a lost object, Hashavas Aveda, which it's mitzvah to return. It's a positive commandment to return it to a Jew, and we don't have that same obligation to non-Jews. Now, it's a nice thing to do, and the Shulchan Aruch, I believe, even says that explicitly. But doing it while thinking you're doing a commandment is a problem. So you could do such a thing, and you would be making what's called a Kiddush Hashem. You'd be making showing the the nations what it means to be part of the Jewish nation and to return a lost object, and that's a good thing. But in general, it kind of falls into that same rubric that we've discussed heretofore, which is just it requires effort and time and your resources to locate this person who might have been the owner of the object. Certainly, it's easier in these times with digital media and electronic media, but it's still difficult, overall, to find somebody who's lost an object. And if you have proper, if there are reasons to suspect that person would not despair of ever finding it, you're going to have to manage that and take responsibility. I still have a book that I found from somebody that I've never located the owner, and I have to keep this book with me now forever, and I have to maintain it. I can't throw it away, and the person's never going to find it probably, even if even though I posted signs, saying like, hey, I found this book, and that's just the nature of the thing. But with this regard, though, it's like if you try and do it as a mitzvah, then it's going to be a problem. So now, returning to your question with the Rambam, to him, it could be that he's going after the same idea, but in the inverse, which is to say, don't view this as like a universal rule, like, oh, I shouldn't loan to Jews with interest. Then it would be also, I should extend that same principle and apply it universally. That's almost maybe even the point for the Rambam, so much so that he's saying it even as a commandment, not like the Ramban, not like Nachmanides, which we talked about before, but rather saying it as a commandment, like, you should do this precisely because we want to maintain that hierarchy, so you perceive this correctly. So it can be a commandment in the sense that, or I'm trying to explain the reasoning, so to speak, is just to say that the Rambam is trying to preserve this hierarchy, that it's a morally neutral act, and therefore we're going to make it a commandment. Don't try to. And he's not saying, and by the way, I don't think he phrases it as a lo sase. He's not saying it's prohibited to not. You could, in theory, give a loan, even according to the Rambam, you could give a loan without interest, but you just wouldn't be fulfilling a positive commandment. Now, if you're doing a positive commandment, then that could just be reinforcing this hierarchy that we've been talking about. This idea of the morally neutral act, which is, and the higher calling of brotherhood, so to speak. So I think you could still view the Maimonides in the same way that we've been describing it heretofore. I know that was a little bit circuitous, but maybe that hopefully answered the question.
Yeah. Would there be any difference here as well regarding whether or not the person is a righteous Gentile, so whether they're following the laws of Noah or not?
Oh, that's a great question. So there are those categories. So there are three categories in general, right? There is the fellow Israelite. There is the Ger Toshav. The Ger Toshav is commensurate with the Ben Noach, right? The person, the follower of the Noahide laws. And then there's the heathens and the idolaters, and they are definitely three categories, and they're treated differently. But I showed in my slides, I think even like I put that third tier. Now, to be clear, most of like Judaism by and large considers like all of like Christianity, and this is the Meiri, this is Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, this is the lots and lots of big people throughout the ages have made it very clear that Christianity, the Ramah, lots of the Shach, etc., all these names nobody here obviously is going to appreciate, but have made it clear that we consider Christianity not to be idolaters, even though, for Judaism, the idea of the Trinity is syncretism, and that would be forbidden. It's not necessarily forbidden for non-Jews to think that way. And so we don't have a problem with syncretism. So you could be lumped into Ger Toshav, but we don't when it comes to theft and murder, etc., those are prohibited all the way down. With idolaters, it gets a little bit more dicey at the end of the day. In certain circumstances, like you're not allowed to out and out kill them, but you're also not like obligated to save their lives the same way you would have to be. Like you are obligated to try and save the life of the Ger Toshav, of the Ben Noach. They get a lot higher treatments, I would say, in some of those kind of edge cases of morality. And, you're obligated to treat the Christians and the Muslims, and people who are not, out and out, idol worshipers. And even in today, I wonder, with the modern halacha and just the way people are today, like even these people who I guess would be considered themselves like neo-pagans, these people who are like very into Nietzsche and talk about Apollo and Dionysus, etc. I don't think that, I don't think that they're real. And there's a lot of basis for this. I don't think that that's like considered to be like real idol worship, in the way that it was. And there's Gemaras that are based on this, but that's, I'm getting a little above my pay grade, and you should take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm not a rabbi. To be very clear about that. Don't take what I'm saying as as authoritative, but that's just my speculation about, today categories and trying to address the question that you posed and understanding, give the high 30,000 foot view of how Judaism views all these things.
All right, well, now we can go into some audience questions here. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat if you have any. The first, raise a point here from Catholic David that I think you've written on, Michael, which is the question of the definition of usury it's listed here as the Fourth Lateran Council. I had remembered it as the Fifth Lateran Council. But this becomes big in sort of certain discussions online I've seen of usury, which is the question of essentially gain without any work or risk. So if you have any thoughts on that definition of usury.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that we can look at this. And, this is a kind of inside baseball talk among Christians. So I don't know if it matters much to Tractatus, but the definition has to be taken in context. So the formal actual proclamation or definition that's offered by Leo X in that document concerns whether the Montes Pietatis can charge something over the principal. Now, as a matter of historical fact, I would argue that what they actually engage in are asset secured loans, but that's beside the point. As to the definition itself, the real question is, how is that related to what actually being defined, and is it presented as from the authority of the council or the Pope? And so if you look at the context of this particular definition, it actually comes when Leo is explaining the position of the opposition, so those opposed to the Montes Pietatis. And it's actually somewhat in the middle of that explication. And then Leo will go on to the supporters of the Montes. And, that's generally split between the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And the Dominicans had to take a one to the chin on this one, because their position was actually condemned, and they were, I think they were formally excommunicated if they taught against the Montes Pietatis. And so, it's not clear from the text itself whether that definition is actually, definitive as from the authority of the council because of the way it's presented. And also, it's not clear that it's closely connected to the definition given its context in the opposition, and also what it says relative to what's said in the solemn declaration. So that's kind of my position. It can be read in a way that's consistent with the rest of the tradition, but Vix Pervenit and other sources are so much clearer that I think that definition often just gives more confusion than anything.
The next question here as well from Catholic David is about Father Coulter. I don't know who that is. Makes the argument that money is now fructative and or inherently inflationary in an American context. And so the amount requested to repay is necessarily greater than the original amount. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So, yeah, Father Coulter wrote, I think, his MA thesis on usury that I read many years ago. Now, money is fructative. You have to kind of define exactly what you mean by that, because obviously if you leave money on the table, it's not going to generate more money. That's just obvious. The way that we actually make more money is you go and buy something, or you give money to someone who's going to go buy something, and then they work with it and they generate something new value, so forth, and then you get back the money. This really goes to my point about the importance of understanding contracts and commutations, because it really, the nuts and bolts of it really determine where the profit is coming from. Money is not in itself profitable. Now, the question of inflation is a much bigger one, but I'd just go back to the point I made earlier about, if the value of the book goes down, over the course of the loan, doesn't mean you have to pay more than the value in return. And also flipping that around, and I've literally seen no one deal with this question, is deflationary forces, because we have seen effectively the value of money increase rather than decrease. And so that would necessarily imply that you would give less back to the lender. And I have yet to read anyone who defends taking more because of inflation acknowledge that you could take less because of deflation. So it's a bigger issue, but I don't think we have time to get too deep into it, but that's kind of a summary.
Yeah, Tractatus, do you maybe have any comments on how this could relate to lending to fellow Jews within Judaism? Is there an allowance to charge to basically repay interest or repay inflation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two chapters that are right next to each other in Bava Metzia, and they're probably the hardest in the whole work. And the first is Zahav, and the second one is Ezi Neshech. Ezi Neshech is the one that deals with interest, and Zahav deals with currencies and the value of currency, and the precise issue of inflation. Kind of shows up in some interesting ways in the very beginning, and it's been a long time, and I actually didn't. I had intended to review it properly in preparation for the debate, but then I didn't get to it, so I can't. The very first Mishnah deals with this precise topic a little bit in terms of just like silver and gold, and what happens when like one currency becomes more used than another, and so you have this notion of kind of like deflation, and they wrestled with this. It was a topic that obviously came up because inflation is not new, and during the Roman Empire there was several times currency changes that took place. And I have heard and I've seen certain rabbinic figures that wanted to make certain claims about the discrepancy of value of the coins themselves. But in terms of contemplating that vis-a-vis ribis, or I should say in terms of interest and whether or not you can repay inflation, I don't specifically recall that. I know that there's a problem so the coins of the ancient world did have an additional problem, which is that they could go bad. They weren't always like base metals like we have, and they could suffer. There was a perception sometimes, even though we've been contemplating the theoretical case of, just currency for currency and all of that could be swapped identically. There were sometimes issues that came up where the currency itself, you tried to pay back with a coin that's been, slowly, been eroded or corroded over time. And, that doesn't move as easily. And so there's specific value to money, is a separate issue, but I do believe it's contemplated. I don't know what the specific prescription is, or whether or not it's in general, I'm pretty sure that we're going to come out, that you're not allowed to charge for inflation. But I could be wrong about that. I'd have to look into it. It's a fair and interesting question for sure.
So we have two questions here as well from Simeon Robon. The first one is for Michael. I can agree to give someone $100,000 for no reason. Why can't I agree to give them $100,000 for $30,000?
So I'm kind of understanding that as you are giving $100,000 to receive less afterwards, because there would be a distinction between receiving 30,000 back and receiving 130,000 back.
Well, I think the question basically is like, why can't, like, I could go to you, right, and give you a whole bunch of money just as a gift. So why can't I give you like a whole bunch and ask for some amount essentially back for it?
Well, so I mean, this just gets to the point of like, what are you giving and receiving back, and what's the obligation? What's the justification for that return? So merely the fact that you guys can come to an agreement to it doesn't make itself just. In fact, this was actually a very important failure in sort of contract law during the 17th and 18th century, where we shifted from a from sort of understanding law and contracts as human acts with a specific end versus merely just acts of the will. And so a contract is valid merely because we agree to it, is the sort of positive understanding we exist with now. But obviously, just because we agree to it doesn't mean that it's just. And I've argued already why it wouldn't be just to receive more than you gave.
And then one final question, which has to do with something Tractatus must have said an hour ago. By this, I'm not sure of the exact context. But for question for Tractatus, what does the debtor is slave to the lender mean?
I don't know what your question is specifically asking. What I can say is that the debtor is not a slave to the lender. He has a specific obligation to pay back the loan. Where slavery does eventually and can play a role is if there's a continued non-payment. Eventually, the person can elect to kind of like sell themselves into slavery in order to pay back a loan. Now, slavery here is understood as indentured servitude. And you're compensate. There's ways to kind of like pay off the loan essentially by being somebody's servant for a number of years. It's not the same thing as slavery, which is kind of in perpetuity. Maybe that's what you're referring to. I don't specifically remember talking about slavery in the presentation, but that is a mechanism by which a loan can be guaranteed eventually. Although it's not the same thing as having a collateralized loan, which is a legal construct also in Torah law. But eventually a person can, if they go so deeply into debt that sometimes it could end up with their family getting sold to pay off the loan. So there is a concept of deep responsibility to pay back a loan. But as Michael pointed out, and this is true also here, if the loan size exceeds the value that you would get for that indentured servitude period, that's presumably going to be loss that you just have to eat as the lender. So there's no working off in perpetuity. So there's limits, and it's not like you're going to get stuck with working forever to pay back the loan principal in theory. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah.
Well, that's all the questions I see from the chat. So thank you to both of you guys for coming on and having, I think, what was here a very fruitful discussion. So perhaps we could end if either of you have any sort of final closing comments. And then as well, if you want to plug any social medias or blogs or so on where people can find you. So Tractatus, since you spoke first in the opening, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I just want to thank Michael again for the conversation. This was very pleasant and enjoyable. I'm always seeking to engage people in dialogue, and I'm really glad that we were able to have this conversation. Gidgen, thank you so much for facilitating it. It was fun talking to you last time, and it's fun also being in this context as well. You guys can find me on Twitter. Nothing has come out as of yet, but I am getting to the end stages of having completed a book on, this is for anyone Jewish in the audience. I've finished a work on the Ramchal, one of his lesser known works. And it is a play that he wrote near the end of his life, his short life. And I'm getting it now into the stage where it's going to be published soon. So more on that. Follow me if you're interested. It's this very, very special play. It's very overlooked in his greater canon. It's called Lisharm Tehillah. It's an allegorical verse drama. It's awesome. I've translated it, added a commentary, and solved the riddle that he poses in it, which nobody has previously done, and it's been an open riddle for the last 280 years. So I'm very excited about it, and I can't wait to share it with the world once it's finally ready to be published. So follow me if you're interested in learning more about that.
Michael, if you want to give any closing statements.
Yeah. So I'll reiterate what I consider to be the fundamental point is that usury is about the nature of commutations. What are we giving? What are we getting? And the equality that needs to arise from that in order for something to be just. And so usury is not about money. It's not about, fungible goods. It's really about the nature of these type of acts. We determine the justice in those acts. So that's really my fundamental point that I just kind of want to get across. But same to you, Tractatus. I really appreciated the opportunity to chat with you. I too am looking for people just to kind of chat with and kind of work out my ideas because I am working on my PhD, and the topic is Aquinas on usury, and so I want to definitely engage economics and finance in that to kind of figure out where my understanding of usury overlaps or contradicts, or what kind of fruit can be drawn between those exchanges. So I really appreciated the opportunity for this discussion. As far as social media, I'm on X or Twitter as well, Lend Hope Nothing. But also I have a podcast that I try to do at least once a month at lendhopingnothing.substack.com. So I have, a bunch of videos or podcasts on that where I really walk through all the different fundamentals of usury, including a lot of the Christian tradition and the dogma behind it as well. So if you guys have comments or anything, feel free to leave it there. But yeah, Gideon, thank you for hosting this. It was really great, and I really appreciate your time as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you again both for coming on and for having this great discussion. And thank you everyone so much for watching.
All right, everyone, have a